Okay, it is 8:30 p.m. and we are in week 6 of Introduction to Criminal Law. And as I stated 6 weeks ago, I said this quarter will go absolutely very rapidly. We have completed open house. We had a week 1 lecture. I'm sorry, a week 2 lecture and a week 4 lecture. And so now we're doing a week 6 lecture today. We only have 2 more to go, week 8 and week 10. And then the quarter will be over in week 11. So I am going to go ahead and just get started right away, share my screen, go over the assignments for the week. Okay, as you can see, there's information about me. I'm not going to go over that again because I've covered that before. I am going to go down and slide down to the written assignment for this week, criminal liability for corporate officers, and remind you again that the rubric is, I sent it to you early in the quarter with an email, but I also included on the home course page as well. And so the requirements are laid out here. I'm not going to go over them, but you will find them. And these are the requirements that you need to satisfy in addition to running your papers through Grammarly to make sure that you maximize and gotten the 20 points. So that's for this week. Okay. And moving right along down to lecture starting today, week 6 again. I also remind you again that if you can't find the recordings are also on the home page. All you have to do is click on this link, but these that are in black, you have to copy and paste them and then put them on your browser, and it'll lead you to the actual lecture. As after this is over, and by the time you guys see it, it's going to say week 6 lecture as well. So, and I will be emailing, as I usually do, copy of the lecture after I convert it to an MP4 and then upload it to YouTube in our private setting so that you can only acquire access to it if you actually have the link. So let's take a look at our announcements for the week. Chapter 11 and 12 of Criminal Law and Procedure. I did send you copies of the PowerPoint and the outline, additional information for each of those chapters for your benefit. And I also want to remind you to make sure you read through those chapters because you have a quiz every week, as you know, and the quiz comes out of the reading. And so the other thing is the offenses against public health and order and health. You want to take a look at that activity. We'll briefly look at that. Then I want to remind you about the discussion assignment, U.S. Patriot Act, and the U.S. Patriot Act actually takes place as your written post is due tonight by 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. So then your reply post is due Saturday at 11:59 p.m. Central Standard Time. And again, I encourage you to reply to more than one post so that you will be able to help make the discussion forum much better. Finally, the written assignment, criminal liability for corporate officers. That is your written assignment. I already showed you the rubric a few minutes ago. And then, of course, you know how the quiz operates there. And then I remind you of my motto: adversity is a springboard to success. You know what that's all about when you heard my story in the open house. So let's take a look at the calendar real quick. So okay, I could hear some background noise. Let's see if I can get that fixed. Okay, there we go. And so anyway, back to the calendar. And so then, let's take a look at where we are here. We're right here. And again, our lecture is taking place. Your initial post, then your reply post due Saturday, then your written assignment, and then your quiz. Notice that until you get to week eight, which starts on the 19th, that's when you get back to a course project. And after you get to week 8, you're going to have 2 written assignments in addition to the quiz and the discussion post. You'll have course projects where you again have to get those 100 points. So I'm just reminding you about that. Okay. So now let's go back to the module. Take a look at that. And again, reiterating the assignments. This fact pattern here, you're going to use this fact pattern. And then in a 2 to 3 page document, answering the following questions. What is the responsible corporate officer doctrine? And would this doctrine apply to David or Debbie or both? And then explain why and why not. And any possible defenses by them under the FDCA, which when you do your reading and when you hear me in a few minutes explain that. So you want to make sure you do it. 2 to 3 pages means 2 to 3 pages, not counting the cover sheet, not counting the page for references. Okay. Then your discussion post, of course. All right. Dealing with the Patriot Act, and then, of course, your quiz. So those are your assignments for this week. Now let's go ahead and let's look at the lesson content before I get into the actual lecture in just a moment. We're going to deal with public health legislation this week, crimes that deal with public health, and we're going to talk about public safety. Those are the issues that we will be covering this week. Again, repeating your assignments. And then this is the section I was talking about, offenses against public health and order, which tells you what is public health legislation. And then if you didn't know earlier, you'll find out what the FDCA is when you look at this, Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And you'll understand what the purpose of that by reading this, which will help you with your written assignment. Strict liability, you should by now be familiar with that term. We've had other modules that we dealt with strict liability, and so it is very important that you remember that. Remember the one that we did with the driver's license, and the person was driving on a suspended driver's license and claimed they didn't know. Well, we said that with strict liability, mens rea, or mental capacity, is not required. All that has to be proven is that you violated the law or the act. Okay. Then there's the responsible corporate officer doctrine that helps you And then, of course, there is some information about the Patriot Act, which came about after September 11th, and you'll be able to see that as well. And then, if you take the time, and I'm not going to do it, to do this crossword puzzle by answering, for example, number 1, across, all the way across, a person who holds a supervised position in an organization and may be subject to criminal liability for regulatory offenses committed by subordinates. I've already mentioned it, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. So then you'll do number 1 across, and then you'll do the next one. You get to down. So you got 1 across, and the rest of them are down. So number 1 down is criminal offenses of statutory origin, dealing with public health and the environment. The term is also used to denote non-criminal violations of regulations promulgated by the government and the executive branch. I already mentioned that as well. So I'm not going to tell you about that. But if you do all of these will help you to review as well. Okay? So now let's leave this and go into our lectures. You know what? I gotta upload. I'm gonna pause the recording for a minute. Okay, so we're continuing with our recording now. Chapter 11, the PowerPoint that's in front of you, offenses against public health and the environment. And what we're going to do is we're going to attempt to cover both chapters 11 and 12, but at 10 o'clock, if we haven't finished, we will adjourn at that particular point. If you have any questions after that, you know the rule about reaching out to me, and feel free to reach out to me for any assistance. So let's talk about this. The Industrial Revolution came about where public health became important, recognizing the fact that we only have so many natural resources, and that we have to be diligent and proactive in protecting those resources because we depend on them to survive, such as the air, the water, and things that are grown in the ground. And so it talks about some examples that create problems such as littering, noise ordinances, anti-smoking laws. In many jurisdictions now, including here in Illinois, in a lot of public places, you can't smoke. In fact, I was in Walmart the other day and I was noticing a big sign that says no smoking in the store, and even those electronic cigarettes. So it's an attempt to try to protect people. I remember years ago that they had in restaurants, for example, non-smoking sections, which I always thought was a joke because when you were in those areas, you still could smell the smoke. And then finally, the law became to ban that, say no smoking. There is no smoking section. And then also, you'll oftentimes, if you go to places, you'll see people smoking cigarettes, but they're further away from the building. Anyway, that's a health and safety move. And so the federal government pretty much dealt with these issues, but states themselves, along with the federal government, established regulatory agencies such as the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration from the federal government, and then there's the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and then many states have what we call their own separate form of environmental protection. And as I stated earlier, these agencies regulate and control violations. you will find that the crimes that we're talking about today are not as severe or serious as crimes against persons and crimes against property. However, and they usually result in fines. However, there are instances that we'll kind of hit on a little bit that an individual can go to jail for that. And then, as I said earlier, these are usually strict liability crimes without any requirement of proving that you knew. Strict liability means that they're prohibited on its face, or prohibited. Mala prohibita, it's Latin. It means it's prohibited in fact. Usually strict liability crimes are very, 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 how should I say, lightly handled in terms of sentences. And it says here criminal responsibility is based solely on the commission of the act. In other words, like I said, you don't even have to say, oh, I didn't know, I wasn't aware. That's not a defense. Since 1980, State versus Budd, it is a criminal offense to dispose of garbage in a ditch, pond, or stream. You know, it's unfortunate, but I've seen people do that. I've seen people dump out of their car, and they use those plastic bags, and they throw their garbage out. It's ridiculous. I've even seen people throw furniture out, you know. But the fact of the matter is that it begins to mess up our natural resources. So the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which prohibits traffic in food, drugs, cosmetics, and make sure that they're sanitary, protecting, again, our health, and set standards for adulterated foods, defines misbranded food, classifies misbranded drugs. In other words, the things that you take, you should be able to read on the label exactly what's in there, what the percentage of what is in there, and it should be what's in the can, container, glass, whatever it is, bottle that you have here. And if not, there is a Food and Drug Administration Act issue that comes from the FDA that administers the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And many states, again, have their version of it as well. But because of the fact that these things often affect interstate commerce, the federal government handles it on most of the time. Now, here's one of my favorite discussions about this. Coca-Cola. When I was a kid growing up, Coca-Cola actually contained cocaine. You know, there was the motto, things go better with Coke, and it was called Coke. And so cocaine's short name, even today, is used for Coke. But Coca-Cola actually, it says, had excessive amounts of cocaine. So it was actually made with cocaine, if you believe that. But then they replaced it with caffeine. And the caffeine was a lot. I mean, it was just excessive as well. So the Supreme Court said they need to cut that down. So there was a compromise, and Coca-Cola agreed to reduce it. And so the question that's involved here is, should the federal government protect citizens? And absolutely, positively, yes, because people should be aware of what they're ingesting in their bodies. Then they talk about these issues like Monster and Red Bull. You know, I personally don't like those drinks, because there have been instances where people have drank those and had heart attacks. And actually, it increases the heart rate. That's what my doctors say. And it's supposed to keep you more alert. But I don't, first of all, want to put anything in my body called Monster or Red Bull. And there are some other variations as well. And so there's a lot of serious health issues. And so now there's a move in many jurisdictions to try to protect minors by not allowing minors to purchase these items. I can tell you this, that, you know, you're talking about Coca-Cola there. To me, one of the most potent drinks outside of Coca-Cola and those is Mountain Dew. A lot of people don't know that Mountain Dew contains high levels of cocaine. When I used to teach special education, these kids at lunchtime would drink two of those. They were Code Reds, Mountain Dews, and they would drink those. And when they drank those things, they were on 10 or 11 or 12 at a high level because of the caffeine that was there. But it's bad for their health. And so I always said that, when they marketed Mountain Dew, when it first came out, they came out with the motto, Yahoo Mountain Dew. I said, well, yeah, once you ingest so many of those because of the high content level of caffeine, you're going to probably say Yahoo, and your eyes are going to be like wide open. Okay, when I was in law school, long time ago, I graduated 40 years ago this year. They had this thing called Jolt, and it was a cola that people used to drink to stay alert, and it actually had a electric ray on it. And I used to watch these people drink this stuff, and many of them came up with serious health problems because of that. So what I'm saying is that the federal government, through the Federal Food and Drug Administration Act, and also various states, have begun to monitor this because there's an adverse effect on the health of us as people with these products, and people should be aware of that. Strict liability, I already talked about that. And, most of them are misdemeanors, but some are felonies. And some people say that in defense that they shouldn't even be strict liability crimes because it results in people being labeled as criminals who are without moral fault. I always tell people that I've been a lawyer all those years, since '78, and retired in 2000, but I still know this about the law. Yes, morality is there, but the key issue is not the morality. I mean, there's supposed to be a correlation between it, but morality is based on a personal preference, and it can be also relative as well. So the law shouldn't be relative. The law should be absolute so that any person could understand what is the law so that they don't violate it. Zoning ordinances. I did very little with that because I did primarily criminal law, but zoning just basically allows for the control of what kind of buildings are built in an area. And, for example, commercial areas have commercial buildings, residential, they usually don't. Then there's some special use issues that are involved. But these are, again, attempts by the local agencies. The federal government doesn't interfere in this pretty much. It's usually the county or the municipality, and these are enforced by their agencies or boards that you have to appear in front of, and oftentimes can end up in civil court, and most are misdemeanors and not felonies. Okay, but again, no intent is required because we're back to strict liability in applying zoning ordinances. Environmental laws, the Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, allows Congress to enact laws to protect the environment, and then agencies like the EPA I mentioned on the state level, but on the federal level also, that regulate and control the protection of our air and our water and other natural resources. So it says in 1899 it was a misdemeanor to discharge matter into any navigable water. And the reason for it is because navigable waters, the waters would move. They would go through and affect more than one state. And like, for example, the Mississippi River starts at Minnesota and goes all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And it flows through various states or abut to various states, and it's controlled because that is interstate commerce. Anytime something crosses state lines, that's when it's interstate. When it's inside the state, it's what we refer to as intrastate. Usually that involves something like ponds and maybe even not a river so much that flows through various municipalities or various states, but might be something that, or a small river that goes in between the various municipalities in a particular state. But as soon as they cross the state line, then it becomes interstate and the federal government gets involved. The United States Supreme Court held that the government can prosecute those who discharge refuse into navigable waters. Okay. The Clean Air Act, as you know, health-wise, this is very important. People got to be able to breathe, and there's some very serious issues. I will say this when we were talking about smoking. I mentioned this, that many smokers say, well, we have our rights. Well, so do non-smokers. You're listening to someone who's been a non-smoker all their life, and I discovered, as many of us have discovered, that there's this thing called secondhand smoke, and secondhand smoke is hazardous to the non-smoker. It is more hazardous to the non-smoker. But the fact of the matter is that we need to be able to survive longevity for our generations to come, to protect the quality of air. That's also why we have emissions controls on vehicles. When you so many years you check. I remember when I came up as a kid, the gasoline that was used was regular, and it was lead in it. And that lead actually would get into the air, and people would breathe that stuff. Now you can't use lead. You have to use unleaded. And then they have different grades of gas. But the fact of the matter is, to maintain our clean air, there were changes with that. And so there are criminal sanctions for violating these acts, and the government is very strict about it. And so, again, the states have their versions, and the federal government has theirs. It says it consists primarily of fines, but it can be, if you, how should I say it? If you do it on a large scale and it appears that you did it in a malicious fashion, or either you might try to, for example, release something in the air that creates an area where many people are adversely affected, and you've been notified about it, and then you continue to do it, then that's when you're looking at probably some jail time and not just a misdemeanor and possibly even a felony. The Clean Water Act, we kind of talked about that, protects industrial discharge. Navigable waters are only relatively permanent standing or flowing bodies of water, prohibits discharge of pollutants from any point of source. Again, crossing state lines, and the individuals who are the corporate officers are usually held responsible. The people who are managers are held to high standards to make sure that there is not water pollution that takes place. Again, remember, our water is very, very important to us. Most of your body is water. You need water to survive, and actually water moves things out of your body and through your body. But if you're drinking dirty water or polluted water, you can have all kinds of bacterial things that happen to you as well. So the Clean Water Act is an attempt to regulate that for the protection of the public. Gulf of Mexico, an example here, deep water spill for 3 months from BP. in 2010, killed 11 men and injured 17 others. But the main issue is that the spill caused extensive damage to marine life and wildlife and destroyed the beaches. And because it went on and it was negligence on the part of BP, they were sentenced to pay hefty fines. Now, somebody said 4.5 million from them. That's not a big deal. You're right, and I agree. And then some people says there should be other consequences. Well, the truth of the matter is that now in the time that we live in, since 2010, it is possible for a person to actually, as an executive or a corporate officer, to end up going to jail over these kinds of things, because it gets to a point of gross negligence that adversely affects the health and welfare of large numbers and even generations of people. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act sets out regulations for how to deal with hazardous waste. As you and I both know, that there's these companies now that take your garbage, and one's called Waste Management. That's the one we use here. And what they do is they manage waste, and that you can't just throw away certain things. You shouldn't throw batteries in the garbage can. And I remember back in the day we had these old TVs, and you'd leave them on the curb, and they would take them and they would put them in landfills. No more. They don't do that anymore. They have special places that they put them, and it costs you money usually for them to be taken away. And so because what happened is it was determined that when this got into the soil, that it affected the food. Animals would eat the plants, and then people would eat the animals, the meat, and then adverse health situations occurred. So penalties are fines and also jail time. And then states themselves establish standards as well. So some of the illegal actions I already kind of talked about: transporting hazardous waste, storing, disposing, or treating hazardous waste without a permit, and making false statements. So those kinds of things, again, is to protect the natural resources that we have as the public. The Toxic Substances Control Act prohibits the manufacture, distribution, and use of chemicals that present unreasonable risks to the environment and regulate the disposal of such chemicals. Again, it gets back to the point that I was talking about earlier, to make sure that we protect our natural resources, which we depend on to survive. Civil penalties, but criminal prosecution is possible, as I mentioned earlier. Now we get to something I've kind of like been hinting and talking about, and then it relates to one of your assignments that you have this week. Foods, drugs, and cosmetics are produced, manufactured, distributed by corporations. And so therefore the law says that the manufacture, distribution, so forth, and all those things can fall back on the corporate officers, the board of directors, the officers, the president, secretary treasurer, the CFO, chief financial officer. Anyway, the key thing is that they're held responsible under the Corporate Officers Liability Act. Corporations can be held accountable if they fail to properly supervise the production and distribution, such as allowing misbranding of food. And then an example here, United States versus Parks, where Parks failed to use his authority in operating the company to prevent food storage in contaminated places, so that, again, to protect the public. So now it just comes out and says that if you're on a board and something happens and you're on the board of that corporation, you can be held criminally liable for the acts, even if you yourself didn't do it. But the law looks at it like this, that you have the capacity to control things and should be aware of what's going on in those situations. So it's a very important point. Here's an example. The United States Supreme Court in the Doder-Wright case that a lot of people will be citing in that assignment stated that corporate officers can be held criminally liable for the acts of the corporation. And Doder-Wright Company had purchased drugs from a lot of pharmaceutical manufacturers, but they put their own labels on it. This was considered misbranding because it didn't give the true history of the drugs themselves. And so the Supreme Court upheld a conviction, arguing that Doder-Wright was responsible and should be more proactive in protecting the public. So this is the landmark case right here. Hint, hint. Noise pollution. Almost all you guys know about that. It came about in '78. That was the year I came out of law school. And it prohibits loud music, loud noise. A lot of apartments require that after certain hours that you lower your music, your TVs. You shouldn't be yelling throughout the place. And because of the fact that you'll be interfering with the peace of other people. So many state and local governments deal with noise pollution, not so much the federal government, but the ordinances within the municipalities or counties have to provide clear notice of what is prohibited. And it usually will lay it out pretty clear in certain decibels. They can actually measure the sound level and those kinds of things. So it's not always based on just the human ear hearing, because some of these buildings are not made very well. The walls are thin, and people can actually hear you talking through the walls, and they'll say, "Oh, you're being loud," when actually you're having a conversation, or you may laugh out loud or something. That's not what I'm talking about. Noise pollution is when, for example, you've been at home and late at night, and then you hear somebody's radio. They have these big speakers. Nobody wants to hear their music. They need to keep it in their car. Well, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about as an example. Anti-smoking laws, we've kind of already talked about that, so I'm not going to get into that. And each state has different areas. I noticed something, I will say this, that kind of shocked me. Here in Illinois, we have casinos, we have boats, and all those places. You can't smoke in them. But we went to Vegas, my wife and I had been to Vegas, but a long time ago. And then we went in 2015. One of the first things that kind of hit me smack dab in the face was that every casino, man, these people were smoking like the Great American Smokeout, and they allow it in there. So that's because the fact that they want the people to continue gambling, and they feel like if they enforce the non-smoking, that people wouldn't gamble at their locations and places. So anyway, the bottom line is that they kind of relaxed them. But again, when you get to the point of public places like airplanes, buses, schools, you already know the deal on smoking there. Now, Florida, for example, enacted laws prohibiting smoking in restaurants and other public places, and some exceptions, they said, were standalone bars. Punishments were fines. I don't see people smoking in these places anymore. It's kind of like a given. and you can be arrested pretty quickly if you do. In most jurisdictions, like I said, you go to Vegas, and it's not. Again, this is a continuation, and it's getting tougher. And some non-smoking, some people that are smokers feel that it's a violation of their due process and equal protection rights, and that, but those attacks fall. And know why they fall is because of the fact that it is going to always go in favor of protecting the public as opposed to that individual right. The arguments have already come out with the electric cigarettes, and that they don't prove to be a hazard, but they're going to still support the courts, that I'm saying, and the legislators, because they want to protect the public as a whole. So that's what that is all about. Protection of wildlife. Our wildlife, there's, most jurisdictions have licenses that says that you can only hunt for certain kind of wildlife during certain periods at certain locations. And so it controls the hunting. The Migration Bird Act protects certain species of migratory birds from hunting. Violation is typically a misdemeanor, but it is a felony to take a bird with intent to sell it. It is a federal law, and you will go to jail, and it is a felony to kill the eagle. The eagle has a special place, and it is a symbol of our country, and most people know that, but there's no breaks for people who kill bald eagles. That's so. But anyway, the state generally protects the wildlife, but the federal government also deals with that as well, because birds fly across state lines as well. Endangered Species Act to keep the balance of ecology. Our ecosystems, we got the wildlife, the fish, the plants, they all work together. The fish, they eat the plants, and then the wildlife may eat the plants, and then we eat the wildlife, and then we want to make sure that there's still some around. So they set quotas about how many you can have and those kind of things, and criminal penalties against persons who violate those regulations. Some examples are the nesting sea turtles. Again, the species of endangered sea turtle, of nesting sea turtles became endangered and were disappearing, and we don't want that. We need them. Whale hunting, this is a whole nother issue that took place because of the fact that what happened is whales were hunted up in Alaska and up in the Arctic for their oil, which was used for food and also clothing and other products. And then when technology came, it made it easier to catch whales. And so the key thing is that now there is a requirement that you can't capture so many. And if you do, you're going to be fined. And possibly if you do it on a large scale, knowingly, you're probably going to be incarcerated for a period of time as well. And that's it for the first chapter. So now let's go to the second chapter. Offenses against public order, safety, and national security. This right here is a chapter that I'd say since September 11th has become more of a topic with all the things that are happening with the terrorists, and actually with the introduction to an agency that didn't even exist called Homeland Security. We already had the various letters, CIA, FBI, and all those types of agencies, the Secret Service. So then the agency that was created based on the September 11th Patriot Act was the Homeland Security, and now it is actually a official organization that exists like the FBI, and its job is to deal with national security. Of course, they work hand in hand with the FBI and the CIA as well. So let's get into this. So the government needs to protect us. Um, we we need to be able to have wide coverage. And so we've had in the past our military forces and other intelligence agencies, and then, of course, our criminal law. But what has happened is that with the advent of technology, cyber crimes, dealing with the fact that now we have weapons of mass destruction taking place in our own domestic United States, where high-powered weapons are used, and weapons that were not single, fired weapons, but they're actually automatic or semi-automatic weapons. So the government has to do something to protect the public. And as you and I all know, it's even got to the epidemic where it's in the schools. And I'm not talking about the high schools. I'm not even talking about the colleges. I'm talking about at the grammar school level. So the government has to step in to do something. There is, of course, the argument with the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, and dealing with the powerful lobby of the NRA, National Rifle Association. And so, again, all of these this is all in that soup, and the government has to do something to make sure that we as citizens feel secure. And so we're going to talk about that in more details now. So at common law, we dealt with the issues of rioting and disorderly conduct and noise ordinances we talked about. And then we start dealing with the issue of if three or more people met together with the intention of disturbing the public peace, then it was an unlawful assembly. And if they took steps to achieve their plan, it was a rout. And if they executed their plan, it was a riot. But what was really happening is that we were moving towards the application of conspiracy laws that you guys have already covered in this past week in your written assignments in Module 3. And so it gets to a point where the public has to be protected. There needs to be order. There needs to be peace. And so now the laws have been passed by legislators, and the common law, which involve cases, now deal with statutes. So breaches of peace under state, local, and federal laws rest on primarily local and state governments. Each state, every jurisdiction has their own ordinances prohibiting unlawful assemblies, disorderly conduct. There is a debate between what is peace and the First Amendment. There is always a right to free speech and assembly, but it may be restricted only where necessary to achieve a compelling public interest. So in other words, if there is a situation that arises where there's some danger to the public and the public interest is more heavy in terms of the weighing on the scales, then the compelling public interest standard in applying will fall against free speech and assembly. Now, it's not to cut it out, but it is to control it and regulate it. So, for example, says that it can take place certain hours in certain places, and that some people have to get permits, not to prohibit their First Amendment right, but oftentimes to provide peace in the community where they're going to do their protests, and also at the same time provide protection. For example, the Ku Klux Klan or the Nazis have taken upon themselves to march in areas where there's a large number of Jewish people living, and as a result, there was permits that were needed so that the law enforcement agencies can provide protection from them. And so we reached a stage where we say, well, we don't want to prohibit them from being able to protest, because if we stop them, next it'll be us that are stopped. So we allow it, but we allow it to be regulated and controlled. So there's a balance between their right to protest and the public protection as well. So here's an example in the Grace case. The United States Supreme Court said that the First Amendment right to free speech cannot be restricted on the sidewalk in front of the Supreme Court, because the sidewalk is not part of the court. She was told by police that she couldn't hold up her sign displaying the text of the First Amendment in front of the Supreme Court. Well, the statute was said it's unconstitutional on the basis that the First Amendment cannot be restricted on public grounds. And because she was told she has a right to express her position. And just because it's the Supreme Court, you can't stop people from expressing their views in a peaceful fashion. And so that would violate the First Amendment right of the Constitution. I mean, she wasn't posing a danger. She wasn't talking about throwing a bomb or anything. She was merely expressing her position based on the First Amendment. The Federal Anti-Riot Act prescribes interstate travel, that's crossing state lines or using the mail, telegraph, radio, or television, and now I think we can add now internet, World Wide Web, even cell phones with an intent to incite, encourage, or participate in or carry on a riot, or to aid or abet any person in inciting a riot. You know something that, did you not know that you can make a local phone call to someone and then the federal government steps in? And the reason why is because your conversation, even if it's next door, even if it's in the same house, you're using a vehicle of interstate commerce, the phone lines or the satellites. And so it leaves and it comes back. So as a result, the federal government can get involved in that. There were some arguments years and years ago about that, but it became very clear that if you use these things, the telephone, and stepped up now, like I said again, with the World Wide Web. So this law has been challenged, but in 1972, the Seventh Circuit, which is the circuit that I live in here, said that the Anti-Riot Act is not unconstitutionally vague. Again, we're getting into the early stages where we want to start to control riotous activity, and that's what that is, a move on. And I came up in an era when there was a group called the Weathermen, and had nothing to do with the weather or temperature. They were a radical group in, I want to say, the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, and they were advocated violence. And so this act was set up, designed to stop these organizations from creating violence or advocating violence in our various municipalities, towns, villages, counties, states, and so forth. Now, here's an attempt here, Edwards versus South Carolina, where the Supreme Court said you can't stop these students from peacefully protesting. The students, African-American students, were singing and conducting speeches. And so the police told them to disperse, and when they failed to do so, they were arrested. So the court said that the students were peacefully in expressing their position. The 14th Amendment does not permit the state to make criminal peaceful expression, even if it's an unpopular view. That's what I was talking about a little earlier. So this is a case which says that I don't care if you don't agree with them. I don't care if you don't like them, but they were not breaching the peace, and that you're using that to censor them in terms of the First Amendment right to peacefully protest, and that's not going to go very far. Okay. The Occupy Wall Street movement happened September 17, 2011. This was like 10 years after September 11th, which we're going to be talking about in just a minute, where it protested social and economic inequality, undue influence of financial and other corporations. Well, the protesters were gathered in a park in the Wall Street area, and the police forced them out of the park, and the FBI, DHS, and Department of Homeland Security, that's who that is, had monitored the Occupy Wall Street as a terrorist threat. Because remember I told you this was post September 11th, 2001. And so the police would try to control their movements, and that created resistance from them, and the protesters resisting, and then many of them were arrested. And so, again, you get back to the point that because of what happened, and you got to remember, look at what has happened in New York, which is the home of where September 11th, the World Trade Centers were located that came down, and everything changed as far as security after that. So Occupy Wall Street was after that. So it's what we call our post-terrorist, I should say, I use terrorist attack or terrorist monitoring activity, where it stepped up. We've always had it, but it came more and more. Again, as I said, the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, was a specialized department. You guys remember back in those days when we had the flags up, and you had different color flags to let you know what level of alert. And that's because the agencies like the FBI and the DHS, CIA, and all those were monitoring possible terrorist activities and was letting us know how close we were to some possible dangers. And so that went away, but it still exists in another form with the agencies and the result of applying the Patriot Act. Vagrancy laws. These laws are actually kind of, I always call them lame laws. Says being without a visible support, being without employment, and being able to work but refusing to do so. Those laws pretty much have, how should I say, been pushed back. And what happened is that these laws start being applied in a status form, which was a problem. Applying it to alcoholics and people who were derelicts. But the Supreme Court said in 1972, and rightfully so, that most states had problems with them. But they continued their practices against homeless and alcoholics for many, many years. Just for your information, it is currently the law in Florida that if you feed the homeless, you can be arrested. Now, I understand the purpose and what they're doing, but I think that it's bad law because of the fact that there are people that are not trying to be vagrants, people who've hit on tough times, and as a result, they still need to eat. And I tell people that, quite honestly, when you help people like that, you also give them a chance not to commit a criminal act, because people are gonna need to eat. People are going to want to eat, and they're going to. I've had people that I've represented as lawyers down through the years that had committed crimes, not just because of drugs, but also because they were hungry and they needed food and things like that. So anyway, most states continue their practices, but I'm not very happy about that Florida law. I've got a bunch of my students down there, and we discussed this issue several times. Papa Christou versus the city of Jacksonville. This is a case where the Supreme Court said that the vagrancy statutes were so vague. Papa Christou had been convicted for violating a vagrancy ordinance. Again, you get to a point where a person is a vagrant. There are actually people who live outside. They move from place to place. I remember when I was in law school going to Northwestern, there was a guy who used to always be on Lakeshore Drive on this one particular concrete bench, and that's where he stayed. That was where he lived. But they changed the configuration of that. It was an S curve, and then they straightened it out, and then he ended up moving. We don't know what happened to him. But the point of the matter is that there are people who they just don't have any other means of living, and they live outside. Loitering. So after this case, the states start trying to, as I say, not use a shotgun approach, but they started using it to justify preventing prostitution or things of that nature. Some cities and states enacted ordinances against loitering, but many of them were considered as vague. Loitering laws must focus on conduct, not the status of an individual. And then again, I told you about the homeless people in Florida. It is a violation of the law to overnight in public places, and I told you about the feeding. So it's there, but I always said this, that let some of these legislators end up in that status category, not just going to try to see, but end up in those situations. Then understand that people aren't doing that on purpose. Little empathy demonstrated. Here's one I remember well. I remember this so well. God, do I remember. This was just before I retired in 2000. And the city of Chicago was trying to deal with gang control. And one of my friends was a lawyer from Morales. And what happened is that the Supreme Court said that this ordinance that the mayor tried to have on the books was unconstitutional. And here's what happened. Chicago enacted an ordinance that said that police officers could arrest anyone whom they reasonably believed to be a gang member loitering in a public place. So the court says that the ordinance was unconstitutional because it didn't specify what were the behaviors, what behaviors, and failed to give notice that an ordinary citizen couldn't. But we know what it was. It was an attempt to, it wasn't trying to stop congregation, but what it was is it just so happened that those kind of congregations generally were gang members. And so the point of the matter is that just because a person is a known gang member and they were talking to another gang member, you could not necessarily arrest them saying that they were loitering. That was the whole issue in a nutshell, and the Supreme Court says you can't do that. We know what you're trying to do, but it's not going to happen that way. Panhandling, we already kind of talked about that. Before Papa Christou, vagrancy laws include ordinances against begging. After the court invalidated many of the vagrancy laws, cities started enacting ordinances against begging. And the Supreme Court hasn't taken up that issue, but I said based upon the Florida law, I wait for it to go to the Supreme Court. However, I'm not that confident in the makeup of the Supreme Court now in not ruling in favor of the people of Florida. Remember, Florida is a retirement place, and you got many executives and senior citizens who were executives who were well off and went there to spend their life in their retirement. And so when people are down and out, they don't want to see that kind of thing. And so the state continues to rule in their favor and against the individuals who are vagrants. So state courts have typically struck down ordinance laws against begging in public. Again, it hasn't been handled yet at the highest level. Okay. Now we move into motor vehicle violations. They're what they are. They're strict liability offenses. Either you violated the right of way, you didn't wear your seatbelt, or you text while driving. There are some arguments that people try to. I remember when I was the village prosecutor in a town, and a person came before us, and I was the one who would ask them questions. Most of them didn't have lawyers, but I would ask the question, what speed were you doing? And for example, they would say I was doing 30. So then I would say, but isn't it true that the posted speed limit is 25? And the person would say, well, yeah, but what about the 5 miles over the limit rule? It doesn't exist. And basically, what that person was doing was basically incriminating themselves by admitting that they were speeding. You know, it came out because what they were saying and trying to say is that the units that measure could be and make an error within those 5 miles. But when you come out and say that that's what you were doing, then you were basically saying, I'm guilty, you know. And then the other defense that we used to hear all the time was, I was driving in the flow of traffic. So in other words, everybody was speeding. And so they would argue, well, there were other people that were speeding too, and the judge would say, yeah, but we got you. So you're representing the group, you know. I mean, the laughter and all of that. But the point of the matter is that it's a strict liability. You know, if the statute says 25 and you do 26, you're technically violating it, okay, and those kinds of things. So, and then the federal government now, with the rules of the road in the 80s, have made it across the country, so they're pretty much the same. Now, except that, you know, too, that now states can determine where they want to post. Like, for example, I was shocked when I first saw a 70 mile per hour sign. I was down in Oklahoma, and I was driving, and I was doing, actually I was doing 55 because we didn't have 70s in Illinois. And so people were blowing boom, 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 but then I saw those signs. I said, whoa. But then when you got up north and you got to Missouri, and then you approached crossing Illinois state line, the state troopers were over there waiting for you. So, but anyway, the fact of the matter is that the speed changes, and it changes too whether you're in a rural or a municipal area on the highways as well. So it says until the 60s, most offenses were misdemeanors. Offenses are not a crime but a civil infraction. So that's why you end up going to traffic court. Then you start dealing with driving under influence. Then we started endangering the lives of people, and you could find yourself going to jail with a felony. Gun control and the Second Amendment, again, I kind of talked about that. Violent crimes continue to happen. One of my classmates who went to law school with me, a guy by the name of Lee Goodman, fought carry conceal in Illinois. We were the last state to have carry conceal, and so now we have it. Some states have open carry, but at any rate, he was just in Vegas. It was on Facebook, and he was marching to protest and request more gun control. And so, you know, the whole issue is the Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment and how it's being applied to allow people to have guns. It's open for debate, but I've already said this, and I'm going on record as saying this, that it's really not a political issue, it's an economic issue, and that the NRA actually is a strong lobbyist for the manufacturers of guns, and that's it. And many of the legislators find themselves with what I call potential conflicts of interest and are afraid to try to take on the NRA. So anyway, the Second Amendment, I don't discuss a lot of that in this class because I teach a class in constitutional law, and there is one chapter, 1 week, that the whole lecture is all about the Second Amendment, and then I break it down. About the Second Amendment. So obviously, more and more, it says more than 300,000 violent crimes were committed in 2008. Well, you know that's up now. And, you know, with every time we look up with what happened in Vegas, which is why my friend went there recently, it's happening almost every time you look up, something is going on. And so now the issue, people who are mentally ill or have a felony were excluded from this right. Well, our president said he wants to do away with that. He wants to allow mentally ill individuals to have guns. Felony records, I know if you have a felony, you can't possess a weapon. I had a young man I represented, and I represented a lot of people that, you know, were criminals who had weapons. But the fact of the matter is, as far as getting a FOID card, you know, a firearms owner identification card, and legally having a weapon, you have to go through those various checks. And so now the state and federal government impose gun regulation laws, background checks, and things of that nature, educating the public. However, once again, and I repeat, we're still having problems, not from the, we have the gangs and we have those illegal guns, but we oftentimes have instances where there's terrorist activity that involves persons who legally obtain weapons. And then to say that at gun shows and places like that, you can still purchase semi-automatic weapons, which are easily able to be converted, as you saw what happened in Vegas, into automatic weapons and rapid fire. It's a problem. It's a problem. And so again, it's a hot potato, and you know it is what it is. So, and then talk about Sandy Hook, where a person killed 20 people, including his mother. You know, it's a whole issue, and so the Second Amendment issue and how it's being used. I sat in a session one time against guns, dealing with guns, and there was the NRA people on one side, and then there were the gun control people on the other side. So, and then I always tell people, you're going to be on one side or another depending on some experiences you might have had in life. And, you know, if, for example, in my family, I've lost people or had people that were gunned down. Some people survived, but, you know, my position is controlled based on those experiences. And in rural areas, there's usually a different view of handgun control as opposed to, and the Second Amendment and so forth. So anyway, that's that on that. So now let's get to national security. We deal with the issue of treason. Treason is not something that we really deal a whole lot with. crime of making war against one's own government or giving aid and comfort to its enemies. No one's been convicted of treason since World War II. But then we deal with espionage. That's the deal. Turning over state secrets to a foreign government, Intelligent Identities Protection Act of 1982, dealing with, for example, an individual that was in the military who sold secrets. And then all of you guys, they did a movie on this guy named Edward Snowden, who is in Russia, I believe. But anyway, he's in a place where they can't extradite him and bring him back for trial. But the point of the matter is he's guilty of espionage and possible treason. But again, to protect the public as well. Sabotage, the crime of infiltrating and destroying a nation's war-making capabilities, includes doing war or national emergency, 30-year mandatory prison sentence if you are guilty of that. We had on a local level here and domestic, the Oklahoma City bombing, which a guy named Terry Hake, and I forget the other guy, that they bombed the building and killed innocent children and other people as well. We're dealing with attacks on American soil. Sedition, the crime of advocating or working toward the overthrow of one's government. It's okay to advocate a position. Like there were organizations like the Panthers. That was different. But when you actually, here's what we're dealing with. Now we get into the Patriot Act and how it's applied, and dealing with organizations like Al-Qaeda and other types of organizations where the government now, under the Patriot Act, which here comes up. No, it comes up after this. I already talked about this, terrorism, inflicting terror on a population through the indiscriminate killing of people, destruction of property. We had that in Vegas. But anyway, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, which says you qualify for the death penalty, expanded federal jurisdiction with respect to investigation and prosecution of international terrorism, came after the Oklahoma City bombing. And then now we come to the Patriot Act, which is where we are now. Enacted after the September 11th attack, and there are arguments that say that it violates the Fourth Amendment rights of people. They said that there are some constitutional rights that are not given, but it prohibits supporting of terrorist organizations inside and outside the United States. It's not politics now. It's turned into actually where it's not a political view that these people are advocating, but they're actually advocating violence. So dealing with racketeering and fraud in connection with certain cyber crimes, dealing with wiretapping, dealing with, there's RICO, which you guys are familiar with now because you had to do RICO in the written assignment in week 5. But the point of the matter is that it allows civil fortress, secret warrants, and searches. And the deal is that we have to protect the citizens of the United States. And so the whole argument in a nutshell is that it shouldn't and will not affect the average citizen. It will only affect those who fit within the realm of terrorists. And so with what happened after September 11th, the Homeland Security, the FBI, the CIA, and all the various agencies now are responsible for making sure that our public is safe. You and I both know that now you can't even go to a big public event. They just had the Super Bowl this past Sunday, and uh, all the steps you had to go through. I remember I went to a Bears game last year before last, and when I went there, I was shocked. I hadn't been to one in a long time. All the things that they did in terms of checking things that uh, as we went through the gates, and it's because people will bring in bombs and things like that in the name of one of these organizations. So the Patriot Act is here. It's not going anywhere. And so, again, the key is to allow us to say, and some people say we're giving up our Fourth Amendment rights to a point. Not really. Only if you fit within that category of a terrorist. And I would say that I'm a civil libertarian generally. I like the Patriot Act, but it's like any other law. If it's applied according to the intent and the purpose for which it is brought, it's good. But if there are people who start to misapply sections of it, the law is not bad, but it's the parties who are interpreting and applying the law. So on its face and the intent and purpose for what happened with the Patriot Act, again, it changed us like never before in this country. And in this time, with this fact that we have cyber crimes and technology involved and all kinds of things involved, it's not going anywhere. It's here for the protection of all of us. Combating piracy, aircraft piracy, wrongfully seizing aircraft with the threat or force of intimidation, includes civil, commercial, and private aircrafts. Naval piracy, robbery at sea, carries a life sentence. So you can end up going to jail for the rest of your life in a situation like that. Again, notice the essence and purpose and spirit of these laws. That is to protect the public from violence or attacks. And then these are some examples of naval piracy, which I won't go over. Weapons of mass destruction, weapons designed to kill large numbers of people. And, this talked about nuclear, radiological, biological, and chemical weapons. I say that it also involves these semi-automatic weapons because these weapons are used for killing large numbers of people as well. The threat of using weapons of mass destruction in itself, even if it's not so, we've had anthrax threats. We've had where stuff was mailed to the presidents and to other individuals. Well, these two people, Johnny Wise and Jack Abbott Greeby, were convicted because they threatened to use them. They sent emails to government agencies, which is a no-no. You already know that you could even post on Facebook something threatening a legislator or a government official, then you can be arrested for that. Now we've gotten to the point where people are starting to threaten news people because of the fact that they don't like their view of the news. And so, again, it's not getting any better, it's getting worse. So these laws are here to protect the public and individuals. Immigration offenses, this is the end. I can only say this. Right now, it is something that needs to be fixed. I have already gone on record of saying that this country is made up of immigrants. Most people are from other parts of the world, and we're either brought here voluntarily or involuntarily. As African Americans, we speak involuntarily. But violations of criminal provisions of Immigration and Nationality Act, federal law that relates to immigration. Congress, of course, controls that. And then now it says most immigrants come over the southern border. I take offense to that statement. I don't particularly like it because immigrants come from all the other borders as well. They're illegal immigrants from other groups other than the southern border. And to me, that's a personal attack on Mexico, which I'm not very happy about that. But the fact of the matter is this, is that aside from what I am saying, it is very clear that we are a country that, going back from history, and I studied going back to the Statue of Liberty, which, by the way, some people don't know this. The Statue of Liberty was not domestic. It was a gift from France. And what it stood for and what it stands for, and dealing with Ellis Island and places like that, people came here for an opportunity. And I don't care whether you came from the southern border, you're dealing with the Dreamers, which is just, I feel really bad about that. I've had to deal with a few Dreamers as a professor that are really, really possibly going to be good criminal justice professionals, but if this is not fixed, they're going to end up being put out of the country to a place that they haven't been to since they were either little kids or many years ago. And then again, the final thing I'm going to say about that is that families are being split. A child is born here from a person who is an illegal immigrant, and they're a citizen. They can stay, but their parents can't. And so it's a movement, and to me, it cuts against what we believe. And then there are people who say, well, they should do it the right way. I says, well, you know what? I says, we try to fix situations for innocent parties. And if there's any innocent individuals that I've seen in this whole immigration debate are the Dreamers. I've even seen some that have served in the military, people, fought to Iraq and Iran, and they are subject to being deported. So we got to do something about that. We got to fix it. And you know, I don't care whether you're Democrat or Republican, it needs to be fixed. It needs to be fixed again. So that's it for me. I have covered both of these chapters. I am going to say that I hope that you will go over these materials, complete your assignments on time, and recognize, too, that the quarter is about to end in another 5 weeks, and counting, because we're in week 6, and tomorrow we'll be halfway through with week 6. So the next time we have a lecture will be 2 weeks from today, and in the meantime, you know how to reach me, and I'm going to say good night. No, I do not. I do not. Because, and the reason why I don't is because it serves no purpose since it's not mandatory. In our one of the classes I teach, which is Online Plus, students are required to either attend a live lecture or either view the archive and receive a grade for that. But until they change that, then no, it wouldn't be any benefit to me. It's more of a benefit for the student to come to the lecture and or look at the archive for the lecture, because it helps them to clarify probably some of the things that they may be reading and they'll hear me talking about, and it might open up some additional questions as well to help them. So, okay, all righty. So I'm going to say good night. It's actually 10 o'clock right on the button, so I'm right on schedule. So good night.